Hello! Happy Wednesday! Congratulations on making it through February. February. We had this conversation already. Welcome to March. Less complicated. It's an easier month. March. March. It's a verb. The month that's a verb. Ants like to do it. The Sharkies have arrived. Hello. Happy Wednesday in March. Congratulations, Sharkies, on surviving February. February. We have arrived in a new month. The 2nd of March. March. I don't know why I'm saying the names of these months so much. Oh no, I've gone fuzzy. Gone all out of focus. And I'm over here. Look at my hand. And then look at my face. You also survived not having running water for a day and a half. What? What happened to your water? Where'd it go? Why am I out of... Look back here. Look at my face. Look at the light. Oh. Why do I sound like this? I don't know. Well, I guess I'm just gonna be out of focus. Sorry. What happened? What happened to your water? Maybe if I go like that. No, that didn't do it. Is there some schmutz on here? I don't think so. Lens looks clean. Hello. I'm all up in your grill. Now I'm back out of your grill. Oh, that did it. Woke up to a burst intake pipe on Sunday. Oh, yes, right. I saw your picture with the like wet floor sign. I didn't realize that meant that you didn't have water. It's temporarily hooked up now via a 4-foot hole in your grass and a hose to your outside tap. Looks like your house is on life support. Oh no. Oh, that's kind of rocky. Ew. I wonder what caused that. That's weird. Like I could have understood if the temperatures were still a bit colder, like if it was getting to freezing, but I think it's warm enough now that pipes shouldn't be bursting. Maybe they got stressed out when the temperatures were cold and then just finally gave out or something. That sucks. Sorry you had to deal with that. That unwanted adventure. Plumber said they used to use a cheaper type of plastic that it's illegal to use now. Ouch. That's that sucks. Farmhouse and I watched Fist of Fury last night for the first time. We watched a bunch of other Bruce Lee movies in the past. Like we've seen Enter the Dragon, of course. But we hadn't seen Fist of Fury before. So we watched that. That was fun. A little strange at points. The ending was... It had an ending at least, kind of, unlike most like Shaw Brothers kung fu movies. But yeah, there were definitely parts of it that were a bit weird. But it was good. Some decent fight scenes, a couple of funny moments. Not like intentionally funny, I don't think. I don't think it was 70s in a bad way. I think it was 70s in a good way. There was no like I don't think there was any like oh, okay. There was a lot of overt racism, but that was part of like the plot of the movie because it's um oh, Farmos is talking about, yeah, there were some like, the like chairs and couches that have like the red marble sort of vinyl look to them. I mean, maybe it was leather, but there was some of that furniture, but it was like shiny and new, which I'm not used to seeing. Um, usually, you know, usually when you run into that kind of thing, it's ancient because nobody makes it anymore. But these were like shiny, brand new couches and chairs that were in that like red marble vinyl look. And it was like, oh man, you would not want to sit on one of those in summer because you would need a spatula to get back off of it. Um, yeah, some of the fights were decent. There were a few strange moments in some of the fights, like Bruce Lee rolling around on the floor with some nunchucks, like whapping people's feet. But like the way he was rolling around seemed really awkward. Like it wasn't like he was using any kind of technique to like get around. He was just kind of rolling. Yeah, the sound quality was bad, but whatever, that is what it is. Also, of course, it was an English dub because we couldn't find a subtitled version, like a with the original audio. So that was also not great. And like it had some interesting group fights, I thought, but most of the like one-on-one sort of duels I didn't find to be that good. Yeah, Farmos talking about the dummies, like it was just he's in this big group fight and these two guys like grab onto his arms and he just starts spinning and it does this like zoomed out shot of him swinging these two people through the air, but they're clearly just like mannequins with like wigs and clothes on and just like chucking them. It's like, oh, he's so strong. It was a little weird. But it was like it was very like, the Japanese people are here and they're antagonists because they've got all the power and they're racist against the Chinese people. And so it was very like, you know, Chinese versus Japanese sort of thing. Starkey say the irony is he probably could have thrown two men at once. Maybe, but probably not in the way that they depicted it. But yeah, I mean, overall, I would say it was a good movie, and it's like it's a classic, right? It's many good kicks, yeah. One bad kick by someone else that I noticed, the like the guy with the glasses that was like one of the big villains despite seeming to be quite out of shape. He had this really awkward kick at one point that just looked clunky and bad. But all of Bruce's kicks were pretty impressive. So yeah, overall, that was like it was enjoyable. I'm glad I watched it. I'm glad I have seen it now. Um, I think I like Enter the Dragon a bit better. That one was campier. Enter the Dragon was campier, but I think it was also a bit more entertaining. Yeah, I think so. Mister enjoys looking for the extra who throws off sync punches in Enter the Dragon. That's that's one thing that always, well, okay, I'm probably not talking about the same kind of thing, but there's something that irks me in kung fu movies is when they have these big group fight scenes where you've got like one or two protagonists against a whole gang of enemies, and the enemies of course all have hatchets or something, and then you see the people like, of course there's someone behind the protagonists and they're just kind of going, well, I can't actually attack right now because then we would win. So I'll I'll keep gesturing like I'm gonna, but I won't actually attack until it's my turn to get beaten up. Like the original Left Shark. Uh, and I feel like even some of the best martial arts movies suffer from that group fight thing. There's the training scene where is that the one that like Chuck Norris is in? He's in there somewhere, right? Like there's a huge like training camp. Mister was an extra in a giant fight scene once, but apparently way in the back being ridiculous. Was that on Arrow or something else? Yeah, I definitely remember that camp from Enter the Dragon. Yeah, we searched through various streaming services to find kung fu movies, and we found a few good ones that way. A lot of Shaw Brothers stuff. Um, Amazon Prime's not great for it because Amazon Prime does have some kung fu movies, but almost none of them are in, like Mandarin or Cantonese or whatever. They're all dubbed in English, and the English dubs are inevitably pretty bad. Um, you got you get the strangest like voice acting in like kung fu movie um, dubs. Everyone sounds like this. Like, hey, I'm gonna give you one of these. I don't know why they all. Yeah, some sort of concept music video for Metallica. The riot cop was twirling around with his baton, pretending to be Link, and I was fighting with a plastic spoon. What? Wow, that is oof. I was involved in a fight scene in Prison Break in that I was breaking up some other people that were fighting, and I got shot, but I haven't really done like a proper fight scene in anything that's, been filmed. Yeah, I've been shot. Gotta love overnight shoots. Oh boy. I do not miss those. Honestly, there is very little from working in film that I miss. The food, I miss the food. And I miss seeing some of the big stunts and explosions and things. Those were neat. Not choreographed extras, just told to be an angry mob. You weren't special ability extras. Well, it's a quarter after 7. So how about this book, huh? When last we left our heroes, they were arriving in Vomandor. Or Vomimbre, not Vomandor. Vomimbre. which we've heard lots about Vomimbre in the past, mostly about the battle that took place there. Um, and this is, I believe, the capital of Arendia. So you know something's gonna happen here because Vomando. Um, because well, our like Mr. Wolf is coming here to have a chat with the king, and Garion has also been tasked with having a chat with the king, and so you know, what do you think? What are the odds that all of this goes down without any hiccups or problems being caused at all? What do you think this all just? What do you think the odds are that everything just goes exactly as like in an ideal fashion? I think the odds are pretty good. I think Mr. Wolf goes in and says, "Hey, don't do war," and the king goes, "Okay," and Garion goes, "Hey, that Murgo's a bad guy," and the king goes, "Okay," and then they continue on their journey. Ormo says, "We just skip to after the scene," and they're all like, "Wow, that went so well." What a great time. Sharky say, "I predict Garion will be hit on the head and will choose not to tell someone something. And will possibly be at least temporarily kidnapped. Don't forget that. Garion will go through a minor abduction. Um, Possibly will decide to take off his necklace and then have some mental influence placed upon him. And Garion will kiss a random girl. Those are my predictions, yeah. Ramos says, "Oh, and maybe we'll eavesdrop on someone and have some angst." Yes, yes, definitely. Um, oh, he will be forced to listen in on something awkward that he doesn't want to be around for. Someone else's relationship troubles. That's have we covered all of our recurring themes? Yeah, he will listen in on someone that doesn't want him to listen in, and then he will also listen in on something he doesn't want to listen in on that someone else wants him to. I'm not I'm not making predictions based on what I know is going to happen. I'm making predictions based on what has kept on happening in the past. And Dernick will continue to be Dernick. Yeah, most likely Dernick will be very useful and practical to have around, but might be a little judgy. Maybe. That's the judginess has only come up like once, really. Most of the time, Dernick has been a pretty good guy. And even then, he was being judgy about, you know, potential adultery, so it's hard to hold that against him. He was just being, like, really judgy about it. We'll underestimate his usefulness. Has anyone underestimated Dernick? I feel like for the most part, just about everyone has, like, really appreciated Dernick. In a palatial setting. Oh, I see. Dernick will underestimate his own usefulness. I gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. Yes. Okay. So, someone has underestimated Dernick, and it is Dernick. But everyone else. Mr. says someone will ask Mr. Wolf that. 5-minute timeout. Go sit in the corner. Polgara will intimidate someone. Silk will just be sarcastic all the time, but that's not a prediction. It would be more unusual if Silk wasn't sarcastic. Alright. Well, why don't we find out which of our predictions were true? What else happened in the previous chapter other than arriving at Vomimbre? Oh, yes. Mandor Allen had his whole run-in with the lady, which is what Dernick was being judgy about. There was Chamdar being a crow or controlling a crow or something, some kind of raven or something like that. And then getting dive bombed by an eagle. And there was the whole Garion just bolting off into a field thing before that. I think that's most. Yeah, and then they basically rode across plains for like a week. Oh, and then they got dressed ahead of time, and Mr. Wolf did not like getting dressed up in that white robe. Okay, let's read chapter 10. It starts on mine most of the way through page 114. And I think it's about 10 pages long, something like that. Chapter 10 goes to, it's like, it goes to page 128. So like 13 pages-ish. Garion tried a magic. Well, sort of. He pushed his mind a little bit, like you said, a mind thingy, but we don't really know if that qualifies. He might have just been kind of getting in Aunt Pol's way. Alright, chapter 10. The city of the Mimbrate Eddings reared almost like a mountain beside the sparkling river. That reminds me, let's take a look at the map at exactly where Vomimbre is. Oh, right, it was way down south. Kind of weird for what I'm pretty sure is the capital to be like on the border with Tolnidra. I mean, maybe it's not the capital, but maybe somewhere else is, but I'm pretty sure it is. We'll probably find out, but it's like, yeah, it's way down on the southern edge of Erendia. So, it reared almost like a mountain beside the sparkling river. Its thick, high walls were surmounted by massive battlements, and great towers and slender spires, with bright banners at their tips, rose within the walls, gleaming golden in the afternoon sun. Sharky suggests it could be in a geographically advantageous position, and that's why the capital is there. Or it could be historically significant because it was this big, tough fortress that the Battle of Vomimbre took place at, where they, defeated Torak, and then that's probably it, because then there was the whole Corodulan and Maya Serana were basically talked into marrying each other in order to try and unite the Eddings. So that's probably why it's there, is because it's sort of like a historically significant seat because of that battle and what took place afterwards. So that's probably the reason. Behold, Vomimbre, Mandoralin proclaimed with pride, Queen of cities! Upon that rock the tide of Angarak crashed and recoiled and crashed again. Upon this field met they their ruin. The soul and pride of Erendia doth reside within that fortress, and the power of the Dark One may not prevail against it. That kind of answers our question a little bit. We've been here before, Mandaralin, Mr. Wolf said sourly. Don't be impolite, father, Aunt Pol told the old man. Then she turned to Mandaralin, and to Garion's amazement, she spoke in an idiom he had never heard from her lips before. Wilt thou, Sir Knight, convey us presently into the palace of thy king? We must needs take counsel with him in matters of gravest urgency. She delivered this without the least trace of self-consciousness, as if the archaic formality came quite naturally to her. Forasmuch as thou art the mightiest knight on life, we place ourselves under the protection of thy arm. Mandaralin, after a startled instant, slid with a crash from his warhorse and sank to his knees before her. My lady Polgara, he replied in a voice throbbing with respect, with reverence even. I accept thy charge, and will convey thee safely unto King Corodulin. Should any man question thy paramount right to the king's attention, I shall prove his folly upon his body. Aunt Pol smiled at him encouragingly, and he vaulted into his saddle with a clang and led the way at a rolling trot, his whole bearing seething with a willingness to do battle. What was that all about? Wolf asked. Mandaralin needed something to take his mind off his troubles, she replied. He's been out of sorts for the last few days. Seems like she never does anything without purpose. As they drew closer to the city, Garion could see the scars on the great walls, where heavy stones from the Angarak catapults had struck the unyielding rock. The battlements high above were chipped and pitted from the impact of showers of steel-tipped arrows. The stone archway that led into the city revealed the incredible thickness of the walls, and the iron-bound gate was massive. It's interesting, that battle was supposed to be, several, 1,000 years ago or something like that. But I guess probably not repairing that damages is probably at least partly intentional. Leave the signs visible. I would guess that anything structural has been repaired. They clattered through the archway and into the narrow, crooked streets. The people they passed seemed, for the most part, to be commoners, who quickly moved aside. The faces of the men in dun-colored tunics. Farmhouse says they were repaired at some point, but the Historical Society made them put it back. Excuse me. The faces of the men in dun-colored tunics and the women in patched dresses were dull and uncurious. They don't seem very interested in us, Garion commented quietly to Dernick. I don't think the ordinary people and the gentry pay much attention to each other here, Dernick replied. They live side by side, but they don't know anything about each other. Maybe that's what's wrong with Erendia. Garion nodded soberly. Although the commoners were indifferent, the nobles at the palace seemed afire with curiosity. Word of the party's entrance into the city apparently had raced ahead of them through the narrow streets, and the windows and parapets of the palace were alive with people in brightly colored clothes. Excuse me. Abate thy pace, Sir Knight. A tall man with dark hair and beard, wearing a black velvet surcoat over his polished mail, called down from the parapet to Manderalin as they clattered into the broad plaza before the palace. Lift thy visor so I may know thee. Manderalin stopped in amazement before the closed gate and raised his visor. What discourtesy is this? He demanded. I am, as all the world knows, Manderalin, Baron of Vomandor. Surely thou canst see my crest upon the face of my shield. Any man may wear another's crest, the man above declared disdainfully. Manderalin's face darkened. Art thou not mindful that no man on life would dare to counterfeit my semblance? He asked in a dangerous tone. Sir Anderegg, another knight on the parapet, told the dark-haired man, this is indeed Sir Manderalin. I met him on the field of the great tourney last year, and our meeting cost me a broken shoulder, and put a ringing in my ears which hath not yet subsided. Ah, Sir Anderegg replied, since thou wilt vouch for him, Sir Helbergin, I will admit that this is indeed the bastard of Vomandor. You're going to have to do something about that one of these days, Barak said quietly to Manderalin. It would seem so, Manderalin replied. Who, however, are these others with thee, who seek admittance, Sir Knight? Anderegg demanded. I will not cause the gates to open for foreign strangers. Manderalin straightened in his saddle. Behold, he announced, in a voice that could probably be heard all over the city, I bring you honor beyond measure. Fling wide the palace gates and prepare one and all to make obeisance. Obeisance? 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 Dang it, Manderalin. You look upon the holy face of Belgarath, the sorcerer, the eternal man, and upon the divine countenance of his daughter, the Lady Polgara, who have come to Vomimbre to consult with the king of Erendia on diverse matters. Isn't that a little overdone? Garion whispered to Aunt Pol. It's customary, dear, she replied placidly. When you're dealing with errands, you have to be a little extravagant to get their attention. And who hath told thee that this is the Lord Belgarath? Anderegg asked, with the faintest hint of a sneer. Maybe I sneered a little too much if it was only the faintest hint. I will bend no knee before an unproved vagabond. Dost thou question my word, Sir Knight? Manderalin returned in an ominously quiet voice. And wilt thou then come down and put thy doubt to the test? Or is it, perhaps, that thou wouldst prefer to cringe dog-like behind thy parapet and yap at thy betters? Oh, that was very good, Barak said admiringly. Apparently Barak's one for insults. Manderalin grinned tightly at the big man. I don't think we are getting anywhere with this, Mr. Wolf muttered. It looks like I'll have to prove something to this skeptic if we're ever going to get in to see Corodulin. He slid down from his saddle and thoughtfully removed a twig from his horse's tail, picked up somewhere during their journey. Then he strode to the center of the plaza and stood there in his gleaming white robe.
"Sir Knight,"
He called up mildly to Anderegg.
"you're a cautious man, I see. That's a good quality, but it can be carried too far."
I am hardly a child, old man, the dark-haired knight replied, in a tone hovering on the verge of insult, and I believe only what mine own eye hath confirmed.
"It must be a sad thing to believe so little,"
Wolf observed. He bent then, and inserted the twig he'd been holding between two of the broad granite flagstones at his feet. He stepped back a pace and stretched his hand out above the twig, his face curiously gentle.
"I'm going to do you a favor, Sir Anderegg,"
he announced.
"I'm going to restore your faith. Watch closely."
And then he spoke a single soft word that Garion couldn't quite hear, but which set off the now familiar surge and a faint roaring sound. Go ahead. Moving on. At first, nothing seemed to be happening. Then, the two flagstones began to buckle upward with a grinding sound as the twig grew visibly thicker and began to reach up toward Mr. Wolf's outstretched hand. There were gasps from the palace walls as branches began to sprout from the twig as it grew. Wolf raised his hand higher, and the twig obediently grew at his gesture, its branches broadening. By now it was a young tree, and still growing. One of the flagstones cracked with a sharp rapport. Or is it with a sharp report? It's spelled R-E-P-O-R-T. It's probably just report. There was absolute silence as every eye fixed in awed fascination on the tree. Mr. Wolf held out both hands and turned them until the palms were up. He spoke again, and the tips of the branches swelled and began to bud. Then the tree burst into flower, its blossoms a delicate pink and white.
"Apple, wouldn't you say, Pol?"
Wolf asked over his shoulder. "It appears to be, father," she replied. He patted the tree fondly, and then turned back to the dark-haired knight, who had sunk, white-faced and trembling, to his knees.
"Well, Sir Anderegg," he inquired, "what do you believe now?"
"Please forgive me, holy Belgarath," Anderegg begged in a strangled voice. Mr. Wolf drew himself up and spoke sternly, his words slipping into the measured cadences of the Mimbrate idiom as easily as Aunt Pol's had earlier.
"I charge thee, Sir Knight, to care for this tree. It hath grown here to renew thy faith and trust. Thy debt to it must be paid with tender and loving attention to its needs. In time it will bear fruit, and thou wilt gather the fruit and give it freely to any who ask it of thee. For thy soul's sake thou wilt refuse none, no matter how humble. As the tree gives freely, so shalt thou."
"That's a nice touch," Aunt Pol approved. Wolf winked at her. "I will do even as thou hast commanded me, holy Belgarath," Sir Anderegg choked. "I pledge my heart to it." Mr. Wolf returned to his horse.
At least he'll do one useful thing in his life,
he muttered. Wow. After that, there was no further discussion. The palace gate creaked open, and they all rode into the inner courtyard and dismounted. Manderalin led them past kneeling and even sobbing nobles who reached out to touch Mr. Wolf's robe as he passed. At Manderalin's heels, they walked through the broad, tapestried hallways with a growing throng behind them. The door to the throne room opened, and they entered. So that's by far, I think, the most overt display of magic we've had. Like, there's been the illusionary horse rider thing, but that isn't necessarily visibly all that magic until you start to notice things or it vanishes. And we had Aunt Pol curing old Marquier's blindness, but you had to be paying attention to that to really like see it. The effects were pretty intense, but this is like I think the most visible, big, permanent display of magic that we've witnessed. I like the bit about, like him noticing that it appears to be an apple tree. Like he didn't know ahead of time. He just grabbed a twig out of his horse's hair, just planted it, and that's a tree now. Farmo says people will tell stories about it for years, knowing Arendia, probably centuries, possibly a millennia. That's definitely going to be a legend that sticks around. The Arendish throne room was a great vaulted hall with sculptured buttresses soaring upward along the walls. Tall, narrow windows rose between the buttresses, and the light streaming through their stained glass panels was jeweled. Sharky say once again there's imagery that is resonant of biblical imagery. Noble's reaching for his robes. And since this series was written 40 years ago, I wonder if it was written assuming the readers know, or assuming the readers catch the references. I mean, he basically just performed a miracle. So the reaction is logical to me, and also he's a figure that everybody in the world has heard of. But yeah, it could definitely be The floor was polished marble, and on the carpeted stone platform at the far end stood the double throne of Arendia, backed by heavy purple drapes. Flanking the draped wall hung the massive antique weapons of 20 generations of Arendish royalty. Lances, maces, and huge swords, taller than any man, hung among the tattered war banners of forgotten kings. Corodulin of Arendia was a sickly-looking young man in a gold-embroidered purple robe, and he wore his large gold crown as if it were too heavy for him. Beside him on the double throne sat his pale, beautiful queen. Together they watched somewhat apprehensively as the throng surrounding Mr. Wolf approached the wide steps leading up to the throne. Sharky say, even the image of Belgarath producing a tree made me think of the story of Jesus cursing a tree as a miracle, though that's probably not an intentional connection.
My king, Mandaralin announced, dropping to one knee, I bring into thy presence holy Belgarath, disciple of Uldur, and the staff upon which the kingdoms of the West have leaned since time began. He knows who I am, Mandaralin, Mr. Wolf said.
I find it entertaining that Mr. Wolf just doesn't feel the need to be announced to basically anyone above a certain rank. He just expects they all know him, and they probably do. He stepped forward and bowed briefly.
Hail, Korodulin and Maya Serana,
He greeted the king and queen.
I'm sorry we haven't had the chance to get acquainted before.
Oh, this is their first meeting.
The
The honor is ours, noble Belgarath, the young king replied, in a voice whose rich timbre belied his frail appearance. My father spoke often of thee, the queen said.
We were good friends,
Wolf told her.
Allow me to present my daughter, Polgara.
Great lady, the king responded with a respectful inclination of his head. All the world knows of thy power, but men have forgotten to speak of thy beauty. We'll get along well together, Aunt Pol answered warmly, smiling at him. My heart trembles at the sight of the flower of all womanhood, the queen declared. Aunt Pol looked at the queen thoughtfully. We must talk, Maya Serana, she said in a serious tone, in private and very soon. The queen looked startled. Sharky say it seems like Eddings draws on religious tropes in order to give events weight, much like in real life people use Shakespearean English to sound fancy. It reminds me, in the series Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, which I've talked about on here before, the previous, like, the High King of the kingdom, who I think it's the previous High King, was named Prester John. And I always thought that was sort of an unusual, like, John is clearly a name, Prester sounds like a title. And then recently, we heard a song on the radio called Prester John. And so I was like, okay, there's definitely a connection. And so looking that up, it's a Christian king of some kind or something like that. And so I thought that was an interesting, just putting that name straight into your book. Pharma says, I feel like the religious tropes are fairly common in this era of fantasy, and Sharky said that's what I mean. Modern fantasy correctly doesn't assume certain religious backgrounds to understand the patterns. I mean, I feel like if you don't notice a reference to like something in Christianity or whatever, you're not missing out in the story necessarily. Like, to be honest, I don't necessarily recognize directly what a lot of these religious references might be. You know, I'm not all that educated on the topic. But I don't feel like I enjoy the story less, but I guess I have no way of knowing for sure. But that said, you know, I don't think that it's necessary to include that kind of thing either. You know, come up with your own ideas, right? To be honest, I think I kind of enjoy the parts of the Chronicles of Narnia a bit less due to all of that sometimes. Like some of it's so heavy-handed. I know you guys really like those books, and I don't mean to take a shot at them because of that. I do also enjoy those books, and I've read them multiple times. Um, but I think the parts of them that I enjoy the most are the like the less religious parts of them. Check, you say that was Tolkien's criticism of Narnia too? Yeah, they're, you know, you can't read Aslan and, like, sending the people to go get a golden apple and dying on the stone table and things like that and not see what's going on there. Well, where was I? Uh, Aunt Pol saying that Maya Serana and she must speak in private and very soon. The Queen looked startled. Mr. Wolf introduced the rest of them, and each bowed in turn to the young king. "Welcome, gentles all," Corodulin said. "My poor court is overwhelmed by so noble a company."
"We don't have much time, Corodulin,"
Mr. Wolf told him.
"The courtesy of the Erendish throne is the marvel of the world. I don't want to offend you and your lovely queen by cutting short those stately observances which so ornament your court, but I have certain news which I have to present to you in private. The matter is of extreme urgency."
"Then I am at thy immediate disposal," the king replied, rising from his throne. "Forgive us, dear friends," he said to the assembled nobles, "but this ancient friend of our kingly line hath information which must be imparted to our ears alone with utmost urgency. I pray thee, let us go apart for a little space of time to receive this instruction. We shall return presently."
"Polgara,"
Mr. Wolf said. "Go ahead, father," she replied. "Just now I have to speak with Maya Serana about something that's very important to her."
"Can't it wait?"
"No, father, it can't." And with that, she took the Queen's arm, and the two left. It's interesting. She takes a look at this Queen and goes, "We gotta talk right now." Mr. Wolf stared after her for a moment. Then he shrugged, and he and Corodulin also left the throne room. An almost shocked silence followed their departure.
"Most unseemly,"
an old courtier with wispy white hair disapproved. "A necessary haste, my lord," Mandaralin informed him. "As the revered Belgarath hath intimated, our mission is the hinge-pin of the survival of all the kingdoms of the West." Mandaralin. "Our ancient foe may soon be abroad again. It will not be long, I fear, ere membrate knights will again stand the brunt of titanic war." Mandaralin, what are you doing, man? Duralin. Belgarath is like, "We have to speak privately. I have news which is important and secret." And off they go. And then Mandaralin's like, just immediately. "Let me just announce to everybody that he just went separate from." Ugh. Come on, dude. Blessed then be the tongue which brings the news, the white-haired old man declared. I had feared that I had seen my last battle, and would die abed in my dotage. I thank great Chaldan that I still have my vigor, and that my prowess is undiminished by the passage of a mere 80 years. Farmo says, I'm sorry, he had to tell them, the king, this secret thing that I will now tell you. Yeah. How long is a score? Is a score a dozen? Hey Google, how much is a score?
20. On the website Collins Dictionary.
Okay, that's enough.
Say a score is 20 or approximately.
Okay, 20. Google, stop. Okay, so yes, it's 20. So at first I was like, am I making this guy sound too old? But no, he is 80. He's 80 years old and ready to charge into battle. His vigor is undiminished. Garion drew off by himself to one side of the room to wrestle with a problem. Events had swept him into King Corodulin's court before he had had the time to prepare himself for an unpleasant duty. He had given his word to Leldorin to bring certain things to the king's attention, but he did not have the faintest idea how to begin. The exaggerated formality of the Arendish court intimidated him. This was not at all like the rough, good-natured court of King Anheg in Val Alorn, or the almost homey court of King Fulrak and Sendar. This is Garion's third different kingdom that he's been into the throne room of. Wow. He's getting around. This was Vomimbre, and the prospect of blurting out news of the wild scheme of a group of Asturian firebrands, as he had blurted out the news of the Earl of Yarvik in Cherrick, now seemed utterly out of the question. Suddenly, the thought of that previous event struck him forcibly. The situation then was so similar to this one that it seemed all at once like some elaborate game. The moves on the board were almost identical, and in each case he had been placed in the uncomfortable position of being required to block that last crucial move where a king would die and a kingdom would collapse. Sharky say, man, I do not envy Garion right now, preparing for an unpleasant duty, especially when they... I guess you guys have running water on the brain, huh? Due to recent events? You've got experience with not having running water for the bathroom? Farmo says, I think someone had been spending too much time around small children. It's more pressing lately, yes. So this bit is interesting, Garion comparing things to a board game. When you consider the titles scheme of the books. First one was Pawn of Prophecy. Then Queen of Sorcery, then Magician's Gambit. Castle of... The Castle is a little, I think, kind of the weakest. But I guess if you some people, like at some places and times, a rook is just called a castle, right? Castle of Wizardry, and then Enchanter's Endgame. And here we've got Garion thinking in those terms. So let me reread that. The moves on the board were almost identical, and in each case, he had been placed. Yes, and castling is a specific chess move. Swapping the king and the rook. It's that move has always reeked to me of like someone important was going to lose or was in a bad position and just made up that rule on the spot and went, but because these two pieces haven't moved yet and there's nothing in between them, I'm allowed to kind of switch their places. Not all the way, just, this piece is going to go here and this piece is going to go. I'm allowed to do that. That's a move. It's called castling because this piece looks, is a castle. So my king is castling. I'm allowed. Farmer says, but bishop might be a little too heavy-handed. Should actually say chess is really just a 1,000-year-old TTRPG. Yeah, I guess if you really got into it, you could imagine little storylines. In each case, he had been placed in the uncomfortable position of being required to block that last crucial move where a king would die and a kingdom would collapse. He felt oddly powerless, as if his entire life were in the fingers of two faceless players maneuvering pieces in the same patterns on some vast board in a game that, for all he knew, had lasted for eternity. There was no question about what had to be done. The players, however, seemed content to leave it up to him to come up with a way to do it. Not subtle. King Corodulin appeared shaken when he returned to the throne room with Mr. Wolf a half-hour later, and he controlled his expression with obvious difficulty. "Forgive me, gentles all," he apologized, "but I have had disturbing news. For the present time, however, let us put aside our cares and celebrate this historic visit. Summon musicians and command that a banquet be made ready." There was a stir near the door, and a black-robed man entered with a half-dozen Mimbrate knights in full armor following him closely, their eyes narrow with suspicion, and their hands on their sword hilts as if daring anyone to bar their leader's path. As the robed man strode nearer, Garion saw his angular eyes and scarred cheeks. The man was a Murgo. Barak put a firm hand on Hetar's arm. The Murgo had obviously dressed in haste, and he seemed slightly breathless from his hurried trip to the throne room.
"Your Majesty,"
he rasped, bowing deeply to Corodulin.
I have just been advised that visitors have arrived at thy court and have made haste here to greet them in the name of my king, Tar Urgas.
Corodulin's face grew cold. "I do not recall summoning thee, Nachak," he said.
"It is, then, as I had feared," the Murgo replied. "These messengers have spoken ill of my race, seeking to dissever the friendship which doth exist between the thrones of Erendia and of Cthul Murgos. I am chagrined to find that thou hast given ear to slanders without offering me opportunity to reply. Is this just, august Majesty?" "Who is this?"
Mr. Wolf asked Corodulin. "Nachak," the king replied, "the ambassador of Cthul Murgos. Shall I introduce thee to him, Ancient One?
That won't be necessary,
Mr. Wolf answered bleakly.
Every Murgo alive knows who I am. Mothers in Cthul Murgos frighten their children into obedience by mentioning my name. But I am not a child, old man,
Natchak sneered.
I'm not afraid of you.
That could be a serious failing, Silk observed. The Murgo's name had struck Garion almost like a blow. As he looked at the scarred face of the man who had so misled Leldorin and his friends, he realized that the players had once again moved their pieces into that last crucial position, and that who would win and who would lose once again depended entirely on him. Pharmo saying Barak not suggesting violence, and it's the guy, the one who lied to our Lil Doran.
What lies have you told the king?
Natchak was demanding of Mr. Wolf.
No lies, Natchak,
Wolf told him.
Just the truth. That should be enough. I protest, your majesty,
Natchak appealed to the king.
I protest in the strongest manner possible. All the world knows of his hatred for my people. How can you allow him to poison your mind against us?
He forgot the these and thous that time, Silk commented slyly.
He is excited,
Barak replied.
Murgos get clumsy when they're excited. It's one of their shortcomings. Alorns,
Natchak spat.
That's right, Murgo,
Barak said coldly. He was still holding Hetar's arm. Natchak looked at them, and then his eyes widened as he seemed to see Hetar for the first time. He recoiled from the Algar's hate-filled stare, and his half-dozen knights closed protectively around him.
Your Majesty, he rasped, I know that man to be Hetar of Algaria, a known murderer. I demand that you arrest him.
Demand, Natchak? The king asked, with a dangerous glint in his eyes. Thou wilt present demands to me in my own court?
Forgive me, your majesty, Natchak apologized quickly. The sight of that animal so disturbed me that I forgot myself. You'd be wise to leave now, Natchak, Mr. Wolf recommended. It's not really a good idea for a Murgo to be alone in the presence of so many Alorns. Accidents have a way of happening under such conditions.
Ooh, that's blunt. Grandfather, Garion said urgently. Here we go, guys. People, sorry. Without knowing exactly why, he knew that it was time to speak. Natchak must not be allowed to leave the throne room. The faceless players had made their final moves, and the game must end here. Grandfather, he repeated, there's something I have to tell you.
Not now, Garion.
Wolf was still looking with hard eyes at the Murgo. It's important, Grandfather. Very important. Mr. Wolf turned as if to reply sharply, but then he seemed to see something. Something that no one else in the throne room could see, and his eyes widened in momentary amazement.
All right, Garion,
he said in a strangely quiet voice.
Go ahead.
Some men are planning to kill the king of Erendia. Natchak's one of them. Garion had said it louder than he'd intended, and a sudden silence fell over the throne room at his words. Nachak's face went pale, and his hand moved involuntarily toward his sword hilt, then froze. Garion was suddenly keenly aware of Barak hulking just behind him, and Hatar, grim as death in black leather, towering beside him. Nachak stepped back and made a quick gesture to his steel-clad knights. Quickly, they formed a protective ring around him, their hands on their weapons.
"I won't stay and listen to such slander,"
the Murgo declared. "I have not yet given thee my permission to withdraw, Nachak," Korodulin informed him coolly. "I require thy presence yet a while." The young king's face was stern, and his eyes bored into the Murgo's. Then he turned to Garion. "I would hear more of this. Speak truthfully, lad, and fear not reprisal from any man for thy words." Garion drew a deep breath and spoke carefully. "I don't really know all the details, Your Majesty," he explained. "I found out about it by accident." "Say what thou canst," the king told him. "As nearly as I can tell, Your Majesty, next summer, when you travel to Vo Astur, a group of men are going to try to kill you somewhere on the highway."
"Asturian traitors, doubtless,"
a gray-haired courtier suggested. "They call themselves patriots," Garion answered.
"Inevitably,"
the courtier sneered. "Such attempts are not uncommon," the king stated. "We will take steps to guard against them. I thank thee for this information." "There's more, Your Majesty," Garion added. "When they attack, they're going to be wearing the uniforms of Tolnedran legionnaires." Sharkies really like how often this series breaks the no one listens to kids trope. Yes. Yeah, more often than not, when Garion needs to tell someone something important, they listen and they believe him. I also appreciate that. Also, the gray-haired courtier suggested, attempting to be relevant. And Pharma says, as he tends to, Garion learns all the info by accident. Let me go back. "There's more, Your Majesty," Garion added. "When they attack, they're going to be wearing the uniforms of Tolnedran legionnaires." Silk whistled sharply. "The whole idea is to make your nobles believe that you've been killed by the Tolnedrans," Garion continued. "These men are sure that Mimbre will immediately declare war on the Empire, and that as soon as that happens, the legions will march in. Then, when everybody here is involved in the war, they're going to announce that Asturia is no longer subject to the Arendish throne. They're sure that the rest of Asturia will follow them at that point." "I see," the king replied thoughtfully. "'Tis a well-conceived plan, but with a subtlety uncharacteristic of our wild-eyed Asturian brothers. But I have yet heard nothing linking the emissary of Tor Urgas with this treason." "The whole plan was his, Your Majesty. He gave them all the details, and the gold to buy the Tolnedran uniforms, and to encourage other people to join them."
"He lies!"
Nachak burst out. "Thou shalt have opportunity to reply, Nachak," the king advised him. He turned back to Garion. "Let us pursue this matter further. How camest thou by this knowledge?" "I can't say, Your Majesty," Garion replied painfully. "I gave my word not to. One of the men told me about it to prove that he was my friend. He put his life in my hands to show how much he trusted me. I can't betray him." What's the dino's name? What is the dino's name? We named him at one point. I'm going to say it's Harold, but that doesn't seem quite right. Also, hello, Mini Cake. We are reading Queen of Sorcery by David Eddings, which is, doesn't actually have one yet. I think we joked about him having a name at some point, but I don't think he's got an official name. Dapper Dino. Dapper Dino's a description, not a name. Yeah, we joked about a name, but I don't remember if he has officially been named. We haven't had him for that long. He's cute. He's tall. We are in the middle of a dramatic court scene, so I'm going to continue reading that, but you're welcome to stick around and chat.
Thy loyalty speaks well of thee, young Garion, the king commended him. But thy accusation against the Murgo ambassador is most grave. Without violating thy trust, canst thou provide corroboration? Helplessly, Garion shook his head. This is a serious matter, your majesty, Nachak declared. I am the personal representative of Tower Urgas. This lying urchin is Belgarath's creature, and his wild, unsubstantiated story is an obvious attempt to discredit me and to drive a wedge between the thrones of Erendia and Cthul Murgos. This accusation must not be allowed to stand. The boy must be forced to identify these imaginary plotters, or to admit that he lies. He hath given his pledge, Nachak, the king pointed out. He says so, your majesty, Nachak replied with a sneer. Let us put him to the test. An hour on the rack may persuade him to speak freely. I've seldom had much faith in confessions obtained by torment, Corodulan said. If it please your majesty, Mandaralin interjected, it may be that I can help to resolve this matter. Garion threw a stricken look at the knight. Mandaralin knew Leldorin, and it would be a simple thing for him to guess the truth. Mandaralin, moreover, was a Mimbrate, and Corodulan was his king. Not only was he under no compulsion to remain silent, but his duty almost obliged him to speak. Sir Mandaralin, the king responded gravely, thy devotion to truth and duty are legendary. Canst thou perchance identify these plotters? The question hung there. Nay, sire, Mandaralin replied firmly, but I know Garion to be a truthful and honest boy. I will vouch for him. That's scanty corroboration, Nachak asserted. I declare that he lies, so where does that leave us? The lad is my companion, Mandaralin said. I will not be the instrument of breaking his pledge, since his honor is as dear to me as mine own. By our law, however, a cause incapable of proof may be decided by trial at arms. I will champion this boy. I declare before this company that this Nachak is a foul villain who hath joined with divers others to slay my king. He pulled off his steel gauntlet and tossed it to the floor. The crash as it struck the polished stone seemed thunderous. Take up my gage, Murgo, Mandaralin said coldly, or let one of thy sycophant knights take it up for thee. I will prove thy villainy upon thy body, or upon the body of thy champion. Nachak stared first at the mailed gauntlet, and then at the great knight standing accusingly before him.
He licked his lips nervously and looked around the throne room. Except for Manderallen, none of the Mimbrate nobles present were under arms. The Murgo's eyes narrowed with a sudden desperation.
"Kill him!"
he snarled at the 6 men in armor surrounding him. The knights looked shocked, doubtful.
"Kill him!"
Nachak commanded them.
1,000 gold pieces to the man who spills out his life.
The faces of the 6 knights went flat at the words. As one man, they drew their swords and spread out, moving with raised shields toward Manderallen. There were gasps and cries of alarm as the nobles and their ladies scrambled out of the way.
"What treason is this?" Manderallen demanded of them. "Are ye so enamored of this Murgo and his gold that ye will draw weapons in the king's presence in open defiance of the law's prohibitions? Put up your swords."
Farmo says, "Not very chivalrous," and the Sharkies say, "Capitalism!" But they ignored his words and continued their grim advance.
"Defend thyself, Sir Manderallen," Corodulin urged, half rising from his throne. "I free thee of the law's constraint."
Barak, however, had already begun to move. Noting that Manderallen had not carried his shield into the throne room, the red-bearded man jerked an enormous 2-handed broadsword down from the array of banners and weapons at one side of the dais.
"Manderallen!"
he shouted with a great heave, and with a great heave he slid the huge blade, skittering and bouncing across the stone floor toward the knight's feet. Manderallen stopped the sliding weapon with one mailed foot, stooped, and picked it up. The approaching knights looked a bit less confident as Manderallen lifted the 6-foot blade with both hands. We got ourselves a cloud strife here. Farmo says that red gold, and Minicake says, "Oh, the turntables. Oh, how the turntables have turned the tables." Barak, grinning hugely, drew his sword from one hip and his war axe from the other. Hatar, his drawn saber held low, was circling the clumsy knights on cat-like feet. Without thinking, Garion reached for his own sword, but Mr. Wolf's hand closed on his wrist.
"You stay out of it,"
the old man told him, and pulled him clear of the impending fight. Manderallen's first blow crashed against a quickly raised shield, shattering the arm of a knight with a crimson surcoat over his armor, and hurling him into a clattering heap 10 feet away. Just because you block something with a shield, if that thing is 100 pounds of iron, you're not necessarily going to be okay. Farmo says we haven't seen Manderallen brawl in a melee before. Yeah, we've seen him dueling in more of a tournament setting, and we've seen him hunting down monsters basically, but only kind of tangentially saw that. But we haven't really caught him in a group fight like this. Barak parried a sword strike from a burly knight with his axe, and battered at the man's raised shield with his own heavy sword. Hatar toyed expertly with a knight in green enameled armor, fancy, easily avoiding his opponent's awkward strokes and flicking the point of his saber at the man's visored face. The steely ring of sword on sword echoed through Corodulin's throne room, and showers of sparks cascaded from the clash of edge on edge, Highlander style. Maybe that's a bit extreme. Kzzz! Sparks. With huge blows, Mandorelin smashed at a second man. A vast sweep of his two-handed sword went under the knight's shield, and the man shrieked as the great blade bit through his armor and into his side. Then he fell, with blood spouting from the sheared-in gash that reached halfway through his body. Yeesh. Barak, with a deft backswing of his war-axe, caved in the side of the burly knight's helmet, and the knight half spun and fell to the floor. Hatar feinted a quick move, then drove his saber point through a slot in the green-armored knight's visor. The stricken knight stiffened as the saber ran into his brain. As the melee surged across the polished floor, this is interesting. The word melee here it has two accents. It's got the triangle point cap over the first E, and then a dash over the second E. Over here. Let's see, right around, if I can get it to focus. Right there. You gonna focus up? Maybe not. Closer. It's really not that interesting. I don't know why I'm focusing, or I'm spending so much time with this, but ah well. Anyways, a bunch of accents in there, which I don't frequently see. I wonder, no. As the melee surged across the polished floor, the nobles and ladies scurried this way and that to avoid being overrun by the struggling men. Yes, like that. Those are the accents that it has. Nachak watched with dismay as his knights were systematically destroyed before his eyes. Then, quite suddenly, he turned and fled. "He's getting away!" Garion shouted. But Hatar was already in pursuit, his dreadful face and blood-smeared saber melting the courtiers and their screaming ladies out of his path as he ran to cut off Nachak's flight. The Murgo had almost reached the far end of the hall before Hatar's long strides carried him through the crowd to block the doorway. With a cry of despair, the ambassador yanked his sword from its scabbard, and Garion felt a strange, momentary pity for him. Garion knows what's coming. As the Murgo raised his sword, Hatar flicked his saber almost like a whip, lashing him once on each shoulder. Nachak desperately tried to raise his numbed arms to protect his head, but Hatar's blade dropped low instead. Then, with a peculiar fluid grace, the grim-faced Algar quite deliberately ran the Murgo through. Garion saw the saber blade come out between Nachak's shoulders, angling sharply upward. The ambassador gasped, dropped his sword, and gripped Hatar's wrist with both hands. But the hawk-faced man inexorably turned his hand, twisting the sharp, curved blade inside the Murgo's body. Ugh. Nachak groaned and shuddered horribly. Then his hands slipped off Hatar's wrists, and his legs buckled under him. With a gurgling sigh, he toppled backward, sliding limply off Hatar's blade. That's the end of Chapter 10. Bit of a gruesome end. Which brings us to Chapter 11 on page 129. We're, getting in there in this book. It's the French spelling of melee. Yeah, I guessed that would be the case. Hatar does like killing Murgos. He sure does. I wonder about that twisting the saber thing. I imagine you couldn't twist a saber very much once it's through someone. You know, like, it's a flexible blade. Maybe it's a slightly thicker saber. Well, that was a slightly longer chapter. It's now 8:30 my time. So, a lot happened there. They got, like, into the thick of things with that court scene pretty quickly. It was not quite so drawn out as some of the previous courts. Um, and yeah, Garion guessing at some unseen players, and Mr. Wolf saw something that nobody else could see, and it surprised him. So that's new. I wonder if we're going to learn about that soon. Chucky saying Natchak would have gotten away with it too if it weren't for that meddling kid. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he was getting told to get out of the courtroom, and Garion stopped him. And we get another sort of positive view of Mandoralin. Garion had a moment of thinking, oh no, Mandoralin's going to rat out my friend. And then Mandoralin was like, nope, your honor is as important to me as my own is. And I'm just going to vouch for you, and that's it. If you say it's true, then I'm also gonna say it's true. So I think we are getting more and more of Mandoralin's positive qualities. I think that's a pretty big one right there. Literally willing to, rather than spill your secret, he would fight to the death instead. So, Farmer says, you're my friend now, so that means I'll defend you about anything. Yep. So, yeah. Some interesting stuff. Oh, and of course, the apple tree. Let's not forget the apple tree. I love that scene. Planting the twig and then being like, this tree is your responsibility now. You questioned me and my friends, so now you need to care for this tree and give its fruit to anyone that asks for it. That was a very, like, that scene sounds pretty religious to me, yeah. But yeah, that was interesting. I don't know. I like that scene. That's also just Belgarath marching up and being like, I am who I say I am, and I'm going to prove it, and nobody's going to be able to say anything after that. Mrs. Sharkey says, hey, dummy, now you got a tree. That's the voice, right? All right. Well, that was fun. I'm doing Stallone. Is that what that was? My friend Chip Alex is streaming Elden Ring right now, so I'm gonna raid out to him just for the heck of it. Say hi to him if you like. He's a good guy. He works in television. Yeah, and have a good night. I'll be back here on Friday, the day after tomorrow, starting at 7 p.m. Pacific time, and we'll continue and find out about the aftermath of this bloody brawl in the middle of the king's court. But good luck with the water pipes, Sharkies. Until then, hopefully that gets a more permanent solution, and we'll see you on Friday. So I'm gonna raid out to Chip Alex. Stop by, say hi to him. He would really appreciate it. And yeah. Have a great night. Hopefully I'll see you on Friday. And thanks for stopping by, Mini Cake. Bye.